Bio 2. We just finished up reptiles, and now we're going to start on our next group of vertebrate animals, the birds. So the reason why these two are grouped in the same chapter is because they might be very closely related, and we're going to see that here in a second. So first thing is we're going to look at is what characteristics do birds have in common. So we all know what a birds are. They're little not flightless, well, they can be flightless, but are little things that are always flying around in the air singing a nice song. So birds, they actually get a scientific definition of what a bird is. So birds are reptile-like animals that maintain a constant internal body temperature. So we're going to talk about how they do that here in a second, but that's going to be an important characteristic, maintaining a constant internal body temperature. And birds have an outer covering of feathers. They have two legs that are covered with scales and are used for walking or perching. So feathers, big characteristic. Two legs that are covered with scales. Scales kind of sounds reptilian, so that's kind of one characteristic to show how they're related. And they have front limbs that have been modified into wings. So those are our main characteristics of birds. They can internal body temperature, they can regulate that. They have two legs that are covered with scales and used for walking and perching, and they have front limbs that are modified into wings. And then a big characteristic of the birds are actually the fact that they have feathers, because feathers separate birds from all other living animals. So this is the important thing. I can all but guarantee that will show up on your quiz, that feathers separate birds from all other living animals. And feathers are made mostly of protein, and they develop from pits in the bird's skin. And the reason why feathers are important is that they help birds fly, and they also keep them warm. So that's two big functions of feathers right here. So they help them fly and keep them warm. And there actually are two different types of feathers to kind of serve those different functions, and those are contour and down feathers. And so we have our picture here. Our down feathers are used to trap air close to the body and keep the bird warm, and if you can look, this is what's actually found in a lot of pillows, a lot of comforters. If you have a down comforter, really keeps you warm because it is actually from bird feathers, and it's actually, they have all those little air pockets inside of them, and that actually helps to hold the heat in. Then we have a contour feather as our other type, and these provide lifting force, and they have balance needed for flight. So they actually help the bird get lift to actually take off and to actually make them capable to fly, and it actually helps them keep their balance as well. And then if we look inside of our contour feathers even closer, there are little things that are called barbels, and these are hooks on each barbel fit together, and they actually hold the feather flat and keep it from actually kind of getting too distorted and all that. So they have actual barbs or barbules that actually hook the feathers together and keep them from actually kind of falling apart, if you will, because they are pretty delicate. So that is feathers. Those are a really important characteristic. So for our evolution of birds, so paleontologists now agree today that birds evolved from extinct reptiles. So birds and reptiles are very closely related. So we know this, the reason how we know this is that embryos of birds and reptiles develop within amniotic eggs, so that's a characteristic shared by both members of their groups. They both excrete waste as uric acid, as that pasty white mixture, and they both have bones that support the limbs and other skeletal parts, and they're very similar between those two groups. So those are three major characteristics that show us that birds and reptiles are actually very closely related. And one actual really big piece of evidence that we have is what is called Archaeopteryx. So this was in your crossword puzzle, and this is a very important word, as Archaeopteryx was our first bird-like fossil that was ever discovered. And Archaeopteryx looked like a dinosaur, but it had feathers. So this is a big key to show us that birds did in fact come from extinct reptiles, because those dinosaurs are a reptile. So this bird had very dinosaur-like features, but it also had feathers, and it had teeth in its beak, it had a bony tail, and it had toes and claws on its wings. So those are all features that kind of, again, cross over between bird and dinosaur, and it may be our transitional species between dinosaurs and birds. So Archaeopteryx is really important. You need to know the significance of that, and that it is basically our transitional species between dinosaurs and birds. We have other fossil evidence that leads some to hypothesize that birds and dinosaurs both evolved from an earlier common ancestor, and so therefore kind of leads us to believe that the origin of birds is still not completely resolved. So we don't really know for sure what the origin of the birds are. It is widely accepted that it could be from dinosaurs, but there are some alternate theories. and new fossils of ancient birds are being found all the time, and so that'll kind of help us further kind of clear this picture up a little bit. So no one really knows for sure where the birds came from, but it is believed they could have descended from reptiles. So here's a possibility of what our where birds could have came from. So again, we have one possibility is that Archaeopteryx gave rise to the modern birds, or the split occurred much before that, and that they're not really related to dinosaurs as closely as we think they would be, so the modern birds came from a completely different group. So those are our two options. Really not quite sure which one is correct yet. So that is how birds came to be, so the question of how birds came to be. So now we're going to look at how birds are adapted for flight. So that's a kind of the big characteristic of birds. So birds have a number of adaptations that enable them to fly, and these include they have high efficient digestive, respiratory, and circulatory systems. They have aerodynamic feathers and wings. They have strong lightweight bones, and they have strong chest muscles. So we're going to talk about each one of these more in depth, but knowing these four things are going to be really important to explain why and how birds can fly. And so one of the other main characteristics of birds is that their ability to control their body temperature. So birds can generate their own body heat, and therefore they're what we call endotherms. So endo kind of means inside, so they generate their own heat inside their own body, whereas ectotherms can have to regulate their heat off behavior. So that is a big difference. So that knowing the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm is going to show up on your test. So endotherms have a very high rate of metabolism, meaning they burn calories very quickly in order to kind of keep that heat inside their body up. And again, metabolism produces heat, which is what I just said. And then feathers will insulate a bird enough to conserve most of its metabolic energy, allowing it to keep warm. So feathers, again, big characteristic. They help them fly as well as to help them control their body temperature. So for feeding, birds need to eat a lot of food to produce the heat energy that they need to maintain metabolism. So in order to keep up with their metabolism, they need to eat a lot in order to be able to fly, because flight takes a lot of energy, and if they didn't eat a lot of food, they wouldn't have the energy to fly, they would not survive, they would not be as successful as they are today. And so birds' beaks, or bills, another term for a beak, are adapted to the type of food they eat. So if you're an insect-eating bird, you have short, fine bill that can pick ants and insects off leaves and branches, or to possibly catch flying insects. If you're a seed eater, you're going to have a very short, thick bill to crush the seeds. And if you're a carnivorous bird, you're going to shred your prey with a strong hooked bill. And then there are long, thin bills that can gather nectar or probe the mud for worms and shellfish. And if you have a large, long bill, you can pick food from branches. If you have a long, flat bill, you can be used to grasp fish. So those are all different characteristics of fish to help them eat. So that's it for our first part of birds. Let me know if you have any questions.